Welcome to the 9th in a series of online interviews with Richard Harvey. My name is Rob Meager, and today's interview will discuss the lecture, The Three Stages of Awakening, a Radical New Approach to the Human Predicament in the 21st Century, Part 2 of 2. And these lectures are from the Sashti Poorthi lecture seminars, and today is the last lecture from the Sashti Poorthi lecture seminars. This lecture was originally given online on January 30th, 2013, and it is available in written form in Dharma Sky, an ebook you can order at the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/books. You can also listen to the full recording of this and many other lectures at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/education. Richard Harvey is a psychotherapist and spiritual teacher. His work emerged out of the human potential movement of the 1970s. He trained with many teachers in humanistic and transpersonal approaches. He is the founder of Sacred Attention Therapy, a radical new approach to inner work for the 21st century. At the center of Richard's offering of a psychospiritual way for the modern era is the three stages of awakening. The three stages are, first, the liberation of the individual from personal childhood conditioning and patterns of survival. 2. The opening and emergence into the life of the heart of compassion, awareness, and authenticity. And finally, the sacred spiritual preparation for a genuine spiritual practice of awareness or devotion in realizing the true self within the divine source of being, and the Mahanaman, or disintegration into the heart of reality itself. Richard is the author of Your Essential Self and The Flight of Consciousness, among many other publications. He works with people all around the world, and his forthcoming book is entitled Your Sacred Calling. And today, Richard is experiencing a little bit of technical challenges on his end, so the video portion of this interview may not be optimal, but I will invite, and it's my pleasure to welcome Richard to the call. Richard, can you hear me?
I can hear and see you well.
Okay. Good to be with you.
And you?
And your video is a little blurred, but your voice seems to be coming through quite clearly, so this is the most important thing.
Okay.
As I mentioned in the introduction, this is the last lecture in this 8-part lecture series, the Sashti Poorthi lecture seminars. And this lecture, The Three Stages of Awakening, was another 2-part lecture, and today we're talking about part 2, and a lot to talk to you about, a lot of questions that I have, that I know are of interest to me, and I trust will be for those who are joining us for these online interviews. Near the very beginning of the lecture, and I'll begin by asking about a term you use, the cult of the individual, a very interesting term, and I just want to read a little passage from the very beginning of the lecture. You share, "It will be a fortunate day for humanity when the wisdom that opinion is not the only gauge of responsible thinking percolates down into the collective psyche. The third thing flows from our preoccupation with the cult of the individual and it is the projection of the positive or negative figurehead, the one who has either been brilliant enough to come up with the new ideas or dull enough. The figurehead is celebrated or derided. Either, of course, is preferable to being ignored. This cult of the individual, can you talk about that a little?
The cult of the individual is a phrase that I use to typify the 20th century. And the 20th century is a century of technological breakthrough, Western psychotherapy and healing and great advance in medical science and all extraordinary things, not for leisure and because of economic financial climates to do things we want to do and to enjoy a more opulent lifestyle than ever before. Communications and travel on a scale of which the 19th and the 18th century couldn't begin to believe in, all have given rise to a necessity of the individual self or the small self, further in the ego processes. So we all most have a great self-conscious. We should refer to the novel, should refer to theatre, of course to movies and particularly Hollywood and media, photography, all of these things to give us for the first time a consciousness about who we are, what we look like, what we think about, what we believe in, who we are and all of this. Now, the resource of that is extraordinary. The resource of that is wonderful. And I'm hoping, to some degree, through my work, to be able to turn that around, at least give that news to people. This is a tremendous resource. Unfortunately, it fell from the earliest part of the 20th century to commercialism and advertising and manipulations in the media, of course. So we don't really see ourselves as we are. We see ourselves as we're deigned to be, so that we're a consumer individual and an essentially conform rebels, definable, of course, and who is essentially in his or her nature. So this is what I'm cult of the personality, and the really important to us in the spiritual world is when we meet people psychologically in therapy or spiritually in practices that are aimed at transcendence, we meet, first of all, is a stereotypical product of this cult of vigil. It is, we have subscribed, albeit subconsciously, to participation in this club or cult, where the person who is heading is, of course, ourselves, and the followers all more or less look like ourselves, because conformism is the great consciousness. We all want to fit in some way, and even, of course, the rebel fits in. Really, in my youth, had the so-called countercult. We still had this idea to rebel was to make us individual. We were already conformed by rebelling, you see. Mm-hmm. Really is no way out. Whichever side of the box you're shaken in, you're still in the box. And that's why the cult individual is so prevalent, so insidious, so difficult to get out of. And this really leads to the main issue or central point that I make continuously. Everybody needs to get involved with it to some degree or other in exploration. Considering who you really are is of great significance to yourself and to the world.
Mm-hmm. It struck me in your sharing about the cult of the individual that of course we get caught up in this self-aggrandized concept of ourself, because we merely project out onto everyone around us, who becomes part of us, who we are. And that in part helps to form, solidify, reinforce this concept of ourself, because we're seeing it all around us, in everyone and everything, in every moment of our day. And again, it just reinforces this message of who we are, because we're projecting it out. You talk shortly after that point in the lecture that, quote, spiritual events do not occur in space and time, and I want to emphasize this because it is so misunderstood. And so my question is, if spiritual events do not take place in space and time, where do they take place?
They don't take place. They don't take place in any space. They don't take place in any dimension that's involved in relativity. A spiritual event. Perhaps we should be very clear for a minute, because firstly, evolved or intense human emotional energetic events are often misinterpreted as spiritual events. So not to be too upset semantics of this, they're not exactly spiritual if you are feeling euphoric in front of the sun or holding the hand of your lover. This is a intense emotional and human event. It's in space and time, very clear. Its reference point, our relationship to other and outward events from an inner place, perhaps the heart, for example. And the exaltation, ecstatic feeling takes place within the body, which is another relative event in space and time. The truly spiritual event, as opposed to the event of heightened human or even spiritual preparation, for example, a high feeling of compassion or even oneness with all other beings. A true spiritual event takes place in the divine realm, dimensionless dimension. The reason that we stumble over words at this point and have to very clearly is when you have reached this or God or the divine realms, the kingdom of heaven, Nirvana, in this place the self-sing reality is not something that can take place in the realms of birth and death. Events with a beginning, some kind of narrative or other, and an ending, which is everything that we experience. These are all the things, the events or the circumstances, narrative of our life when, as the delightfully say, we are wayfarers with just these two definite points. You know what they are, birth, death. For the rest of it, wayfarers through life. Mm-hmm. But in the divine realm, there's no passing of time, there's no movement of objects in space, there is no space, there is nothing to find, and there's nothing to be lost. This is the place of the divine person, whom you and I and every participate in and comprise, if you will. Mm-hmm. And in this sourceless condition of everything that arises, it's like, of course, to the sun frequently, for the simple reason that you, the plant in a pot beside you, the books, anything at all you want to name and point, will not be here without the sun, without the light. None of these things will be present. The sun is giving rise to all the life in the solar system. It is the sourceless source of reality that underpins everything, but not an objective relationship. So the reality, the thing you can say about human and all of the events of our lives is, to what degree can we open and stand aside and ultimately surrender to the light of that sourceless source coming through? That's the divine permeating into the relative world, what's called Puryatita. It's when the light of truth permeates all the transient, just temporary arising forms.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the answer. It's by no means original, absolutely traditional. It's not that difficult to grasp. It needs to be put into words. Obviously, it's wordless, but its existence is fundamental to any true spiritual pursuit.
There's a point in the lecture where you talk about your awareness of why you left Source or the Divine. And I'll read, again, just a little précis leading into that awareness on your part. You shared that in devising the 3 stages, I have simply been observant. I have watched and learned. It is a process I have always been involved in and enthusiastic about. As early as I can remember, I watched. I didn't feel overly preoccupied with this world. I knew there was another, and I knew I had been there and that I had left it. The reason I had left it only became clear to me much later when I realized I was here to heal. And you did not go on to expand on that point in the lecture. And so I wanted to come back to it and ask, from that sharing, why did you leave Source? Was it because you were here to heal? And does everyone leave Source for the same reason?
The individual spark that leaves Source, much like the droplet of water parting from the river in a temporary waterfall, of course, remains part of the Source. So what I'm talking about there was the aspect of temporality, being divided from the Source. But in reality, of course, you really are. There's just a temporary experience that somehow you may be different. And if you can find the calling, the tendency, or when you get out of the, what is it that takes you over, and that will be the closest to your divine purpose, and therefore closest to your true nature. How much it matters, of course, we never really know. There are so many great spirits through the 1,000 years so far of humanity, many have ever heard of. Even some that we've heard have had more impact on the state of the world. Some who are remarkable spiritual masters, incredibly negative impact. You might interpret the state of the world. So whether it's helpful or a good thing, we don't. I think that you are compelled to align yourself as close as you can with purpose, if you will. And mine is out to be a kind of gatekeeper. You know, I think these quaint ways of saying you listen to the spiritual, like Thich Nhat Hanh, Ram Dass, these kinds of guys, they all, a quaint way of, like Ram Dass's the chicken soup. Mm-hmm. You know, neem karoli is the main course. You know, this is a nice idea. When I think of what I do, it feels like it's a gatekeeper, really. I stand at a gate and I to advertise the fact that you can go through it and there's something beautiful, and how we can talk to it, how we can experience it, how we can bring or retrieve any of it, another matter, but and there, not because I choose to, but when I get away, that's the closest thing I can describe to the move of God within me. And so you might want another job. You might even wish you didn't have that job, and that you were more in your individuality, and talking to a lovely woman who spoke about the very interesting predicament in which and colleague of hers, and she envied her. So then we went into the very interesting topic of dying in. That could mean, in other words, death as a symbol rather than the actuality of what had happened recently to her friend who had pancreatic cancer and was finally merely days to live. But this envy is something which I think people with a spiritual purpose can understand. We don't shy away from that because we feel that wonderful attraction to as a symbol. And the symbol, like all symbols, communication between the outer or the human and the divine. So in that communication, you take a lot of pleasure in this life, in that communication. So I came here to be a gatekeeper, but it was certainly unavoidable. And I think that the sort of quarter of years was not clear to me in any shape or form. And the misery and the travail of the early years, it was only by the time into my 30s and looked back that I saw what a tremendous curriculum that when people would come to me, just wasn't so difficult for me to relate or to empathize. You find in time that even the depths of your misery, your pain and suffering are divine contributions.
You're very intuitive, as always, because I want to use this this point about travail and misery as a lead into the next inquiry. And there's just a very brief statement you share. The inner journey is a process of loss. The inner journey is a process of loss. And I noted when I heard that the first time in the lecture and then reread it in the manuscripts, that paradoxically the inner journey is also a process of pain. Paradoxically, I mean, it's very releasing, but it seems one has to go through the painful part first, the misery as you spoke about. Do we have to experience the loss first before we experience the gain? And do we, in Buddhist philosophy, have to suffer?
Is that pain or gain, you're saying? Did you say do you have to experience pain before?
Do we have to experience the loss first before we can experience gain? That's in reference to your comment in the lecture, the inner journey is a process of loss. And then I went on to ask if this is aligned with the Buddhist philosophy of that we have to suffer.
It's interesting. I don't know if you're, but Hunter, the great American lyricist, wrote songs with Jerry Garcia, and he once said of the audience's hearings of lyrics that sometimes they were better than the words he'd actually composed. And he was serious. He had a lot of respect for the mishearing of song. And my mishearing of gain or pain also reminds me that it's material. In some ways they go together. I think the answer to your question, the pain the suffering precedes the experience of loss because the central issue is attachment. Attachment and identification. You know, everything that's suffering or painful or I think we see it as evil or miserable, you know, in the world is predicated on only one thing, the identification with I.
Mm-hmm.
You and I, everyone else we know, we identify with, you know, you call me, I call you, to our friend say, hi, who? It's, you know, hi, I'm Richard. You know, straight away. There's the first lie, you might say. The first lie is the I. And all of the suffering, all of the so-called evils of the world are predicated on identification of oneself as a separate entity. It's not quite so obvious when it's people like me and probably the people listening to this who are of a psychospiritual persuasion. When you look at the experiments and the considerations of the atrocities in Nazi Germany, for example, or the atrocities on today where we read things and we say, well, how could that, I mean, how can a human being inflict that onto another human being or an animal? How could you actually do it?
Mm-hmm.
And you just imagine, and yet you have a duty somehow to feel compassion not only to the victim, but to the perpetrator. You know that it's no ultimately to say, well, kill the bastard. You know, we will execute him, whether in a so-called human way, you know, inhumane way. I mean, any of that is inhumane because the same criticism or judgment brought to the act, you have to bring to your response. So the only possible response is out of love, somehow, however hard it is, because you're not separate, not only from animals who suffer or people who suffer, but those who are causing the suffering. And pain and attachment is predicated on identification with the I, and this is what has to go. This is the loss. This is why I say inner work is a process of loss, because it's those words that covers it, even through levels. I mean, you could say in inner work that the first you far is an exploration of dependency, because it's most certainly going to be an exploration of early childhood survival stages, and they're all based on what you were dependent in those early years. So you say that, but if you want to traverse the levels of inner work, even the higher, it's loss, 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 until you're left, you know, like a story with the sadhu approaches the Buddha, you know, that the Buddha looks at him and the sadhu is bringing gourd that he's holding on to and says, drop it. It's the right hand gourd. The sadhu, the left hand gourd he carries approaching. Now he has no gift. Buddha looks at him and says, drop it. And it's said he became enlightened in that moment. He had no gifts left. He was carrying nothing. A sadhu is a life spiritual disciplinarian. Approaches naked, perhaps in cloth, but of course he has himself as a gift or a distraction from his meeting with one, you see. And the Buddha says, and so he not only can he meet, but he can also feast of that delusion of giving. So you're faced with this issue of of the identification of the separate self for reason one.
There's an interesting paragraph that I first want to share with you that'll lead into my next question. It says the final paradox is that you seek enlightenment, but enlightenment only is when you are not. This is fundamental, and it is fundamentally obfuscating, confusing, surely the ultimate dilemma. But what deep sense it makes. Consider desire, an endless tunnel of frustration, since you cannot possibly want what you want once you have got it. That would be the death of desire, and desire feeds upon itself, as every restless human being must know. Here, in the reality of the enlightened state, you have not the opposite, which is merely the flip side, but a trans-dimensional leap. To have what you want, you must pay with everything you have. How? By letting go totally. And I remember years ago, I felt I was being taught a lesson at the time, and that was the degree to which I want something in life is the degree to which I have to give up something else to get it. And are we saying the same things? You know, to have what you want, you must pay with everything you have. How? By letting go. Totally. That's what you share in the lecture. And again, I had this awareness a couple of decades ago of the degree to which I want something in life is the degree to which I have to give up something else to get it. Are we saying the same thing?
I think there's a relationship there, because if you look, even at the relative world, which is that everything, as I think I said in one of the lectures before, is impelled towards its demise. Everything moving towards the pinnacle or the final symphonic climax. You look at the natural world, which is my preference, you will notice that when it's zenith and you sit there saying, wow, it's really great, seasons turn, it moves on into summer, and countries, of course, but summer is a dramatic trauma. Things become very dry where I live in Andalusia. So spring is very pronounced, moving into summer, the same as moving into fall, and then fall into winter. You're just appreciating the grassy, the orange, the red, all this wonderful mood of autumn, and this stark, black, white atmosphere on you, and then you're in the beauty of winter. And so look at the natural world, and to some degree even our internal worlds, in what you're referring, how you have to give up something to receive something else, feeling and experiencing the sense of nothing really being destroyed, the feeling of interrelation objects and events through seasonal and other periodic cyclical dynamic of life. I think it's exactly what I'm talking about. It's a way in which you find the metaphors to even talk, because as a keeper, and I'm sure for you in ministry, sometimes we just got to talk about it. People say, hey, this and what's that? And your faith with this wonderful of getting words to what actually wordless. Mm-hmm. And at this point, what the Buddha did, and pack it up and just sit.
Yeah.
And then push that even and show, or you that there is many spiritual masters have traditionally, or you can make the tremendous compromise that we both do of something, and even as you utter, it dies before you. But if somehow it can be, somehow it can be translucent with light. The truth can somehow come behind it. Nisarga, for example, who of course walked his whole life up to he finally died of throat cancer. Say words are merely trapdoors. He used to say, words, it's that they work as trapdoors into truth. You through into the truth. So this is what we're trying to do with the word, and this is what we should. This dynamic that you're talking and I'm talking about, in which we have to ultimately. There is an exchange between myself and the transcendence of the self. That's the ultimate one.
Towards the end of the lecture, you share another example of where your views on therapy and spirituality may differ significantly from the mainstream. And I want to read it back to you and for the benefit of all those listening. You share that God has become enmeshed with our psychological frailties, our deep inner yearnings for human connection. Many of us have yearnings for a father, a loving male, a consistent, wise, authoritative, not authoritarian, guiding presence in our lives that we can depend on. Our need can seem so big that it expands beyond the realms of time, space, and common sense, and we imagine we need a supernatural father, a man in the sky, a deity, when all we really need is contact with other human beings. Seeking human contact feels risky to our childlike minds and hearts. We fear to risk rejection, the main abandonment, the challenge to our sense of self-worth, self-esteem, the hurt of rejection, and the pain of love not reciprocated. But this is no reason to forfeit God. Look for God inside. Look for God inside yourself and inside others. Be heretical. Be rebellious. Take your ideas about God apart, and I think you will find God is profoundly human. Then seek God in relationship and connection and communication, in your routine, your physical exercise, your spiritual practice, everything. God then is you, and you are God. Some traditions would label that as heresy. And my question is how did you come to know this?
No, you see, I don't think I came to know it. I mean, one of my if you will, of working with people, I have a few secrets of working with individuals inner work, and one is that I didn't really have a preparatory road. I always had a conviction, a central conviction from the very, very earliest memories. For me, were either in there or in my bedroom. They were, I think, exclusively lonely. They were exclusively in solitude. And they were exclusively, I guess, withdrawn, really, and within. And for me, I didn't come to know this conviction divine, but it had no reference points in me. The family were religious. They were not even particularly literate or interested in art, for example. And when I went to the church, it didn't strike me as a spiritual place. Religion didn't strike me as when I was very young. School didn't strike me as understanding this. And that's why it was such a homecoming when I was about 24 to walk into a group of people who did seem to understand, and who had knowledge of Eastern, Middle Eastern religions and Southern religions, different traditions, and this whole world ecology and innerness became apparent to me. I didn't know that people knew particularly. I had discovered art at that time, which was a big help. I hadn't really discovered a group of people who I could feel were kin. So just some of those always knew. I'm not sure, it wasn't really an issue at the time, but when you said you come to know, I things that you do. I mean, I went to India and say that you do, in my generation you kind of did. You went to a monastery and you hung out and you saw meditation and retreats and different disciplines and all this kind of thing. And I did all that, but that wasn't how I knew. I already, you see, I was looking for a reference point in place, this birth and death, where I could was amongst spirits. And to some degree I found that. It certainly felt like that at the time. None of those things were other than an outward, that they were not an inward relation because it wasn't needed. And when I say with all humility, I know it isn't like that for everybody, but I know it is like that for some. And therefore, what you do with that knowledge is appreciate that people are in a different place in regard to the divine, in regard to God, and not everyone have to strive to find it, to find the divine. Some will, and some will never find it.
In this time and space.
In this time, in this life.
Yeah.
At this time, yeah.
Once again, we've come to the end of our time for the interview today. And allow me to mention, if I may, this being the last of the interviews for the Sashti Poorthi lecture seminars. And when we come together the next time, we'll talk about, as an introduction, the next lecture series, which is the Panchavati discourses, and that a 6-part lecture series, of which there's a very interesting 3 parts of that 6-part lecture that talks of how the soul is born into the world, which is a very interesting trilogy of lectures as part of the Panchavati discourses. So I look forward in a fortnight to introducing those lectures and talking about the series as a whole with you.
Fantastic. Looking forward.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Robert.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.